There's a moment, and maybe you've had it too, where the world goes quiet in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a held breath, like something just decided to pay attention to you. I've lived along the Cimarron my whole life. I know the sound of that creek in every season, the way it chatters over limestone in spring, the way it goes thick and slow in August heat, the way it whispers under a skin of ice when November comes early. I know it the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat. You don't think about it. You just know when something's wrong. The evening this story begins, the creek was wrong. Not loud wrong, not anything you could point at and name, just the birds had stopped. The water sounded different. And there was a shadow at the bend that didn't belong to any tree I'd ever mapped in 31 years of walking that bank. I almost turned around. I almost went back to the house, poured myself a cup of something hot, and told myself my eyes were tired. But I didn't. And what I found in that shadow, or rather, what stepped out of it, changed the way I understood almost everything I thought I knew about pride, about silence, and about what it costs a person to ask for help when the world has given them every reason not to trust the hands being offered. This is not a simple story. It doesn't end clean. Some of the doors it opens I'm still standing in front of, not sure whether to walk through. But I'll tell it to you straight, the way it happened, the way it felt. Starting at the creek. Starting with the shadow that moved. I keep a ledger. Not a diary, I want to be clear about that. Diaries are for people who have time to sit and feel things in real time. I don't have that luxury. What I keep is a working ledger. Columns, entries, observations. Feed costs on the left. Weather notes on the right. Sometimes, when something happens that doesn't fit in either column, I write it in the margin in pencil so I can erase it later if it turns out not to matter. What happened that evening started as a margin note. It became something I can't erase. The date was the 9th of September, which I know because I'd spent the better part of it arguing with a feed merchant over a short delivery, and the whole mess was dated and documented. By the time I walked the south fence line, my habit, every evening before supper, 3 miles out and 3 miles back, the light was already going orange and the shadows were long enough to make familiar things look strange. The Cimarron runs along the eastern edge of my land, maybe 200 yards from the fence. Most evenings I can hear it but not see it. That evening I could hear something else. Not dramatic, not what you'd call alarming, just a sound that didn't belong, a weight being moved, something that wasn't water and wasn't wind. I stopped. My ledger was in my coat pocket. I had the habit, still do, of tapping it with 2 fingers when I'm uncertain about something, like I'm checking to see if it's still there. I tapped it twice, stood still, listened. The birds on the south bank had gone silent. That's the thing I remember most clearly now, the particular quality of that silence. Birds don't go quiet because nothing is happening. They go quiet because something is happening and they've decided it's none of their business. I walked toward the creek. The bank at the bend is lower than the rest. There's a shallow shelf of limestone that juts out, and the water runs maybe 6 inches deep over it at this time of year. In spring, it's a crossing point for deer. In summer, the cottonwoods hang over it and it's the coolest spot on the whole property. In September, it's just quiet, usually empty. It was not empty. He was sitting with his back against the largest cottonwood, legs stretched in front of him, one hand flat on the limestone beside him like he was trying to feel the temperature of the stone. His head was down. From 20 feet away, in fading light, I couldn't tell much. Dark hair, worn clothing, the particular stillness of a person who has been still for a long time and has stopped trying to make it look natural. I should tell you that I was not afraid. That would be a cleaner story. The truth is more complicated. I felt a surge of something that was part caution, part recognition, part something I don't have a precise column for. My hand went to my coat pocket and tapped the ledger again. Twice. I said, "Creek's been running low. Not much of a place to hide." I don't know why that was the first thing I said. I've thought about it since. I think it was because I wanted to acknowledge immediately that I could see him, not as a threat, but as a person who had been trying not to be seen and deserved to know that strategy hadn't worked. He looked up. I had expected many things. Hostility, maybe. Wariness, certainly. Flight, possibly. The moment of scrambling up in a way that I'd seen from men who'd been caught sheltering on the wrong side of a property line before. What I had not expected was exhaustion so complete it had rearranged his face. He was Apache. I recognized the beadwork on the leather band at his wrist, not because I was educated in such things then, but because I'd seen that particular pattern once before, years ago, at a trading post near the territorial line, and the woman selling them had told me the pattern came from a specific band in the southeastern ranges. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. Exhaustion compresses age the way drought compresses a creek. He had a wound on his right side, wrapped in what had once been a cloth but was now something darker and less useful. He was holding himself in the specific, careful way of a person managing pain that has been going on too long. He didn't answer my comment about the creek. He said, in English that carried the particular precise quality of a language learned rather than inherited, "I have not taken anything." I said, "I know." He said, "You don't know." I said, "You're right, I don't." I crouched down, not because I thought it would make him trust me. I wasn't operating on that level yet. I crouched because my knees were tired, and because standing over a sitting, wounded man felt like a posture I didn't want to be in. The ledger pressed against my ribs through the coat pocket. Up close, the wound was worse than it had looked from a distance. Something had gone through the right side below his ribs, not deep enough to be immediately fatal, I thought, though I had limited expertise in such assessments and was aware of that limitation. It had been tended to, some time ago, with skill and care. And then circumstances had intervened, and the tending had stopped, and now it was infected in the way that wounds become infected when they don't get what they need. I said, "How long?" He looked at me. The question was open enough to mean several things, and he chose which one to answer. 4 days, he said, "since the crossing." I didn't ask what crossing. I wrote it in the margin of my mind. "You need clean water and better than that cloth," I said. "I need many things," he said. There was no bitterness in it. It was a pure statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who has long since made his peace with the distance between what he needs and what he has. I stood up. My knees complained about the crouching, and then about the standing, and I ignored both of them. "My house is 8 minutes that direction," I said, pointing south. "My name is Cal Brennan. I have water that isn't from this creek, and I have clean cloth and something for fever. I also have opinions about feed merchants that I'll likely keep to myself." He watched me. The cottonwood moved overhead. The creek ran over the limestone shelf with its low September murmur. "Why?" he said. Not "why would you help me?" Just, "why?" The whole question compressed into one syllable, carrying 4 days of pain and a lifetime of reasons not to expect the answer he was looking for. I said, "Because you're sitting in my favorite spot on this whole property, and I'd like to be able to come back here without thinking about what I walked past." He almost smiled, I think. The light was mostly gone by then, and I might have invented it. His name, he told me later, much later, after the fever broke and the water had done its work, and he'd slept for the better part of 2 days in the spare room off the kitchen, was Tohono. He did not offer a second name. I did not ask for one. The ledger has its own system of naming. I wrote him in the left margin of the September 9th entry as T, and left the right column blank because nothing that happened that evening belonged in the weather notes. What I want to tell you about that first night is not the logistics of the wound, which were grim, or the logistics of getting him from the creek bank to the house, which were slow and painful for reasons neither of us acknowledged out loud. What I want to tell you is what happened at the gate. My property has a wooden gate at the south fence line, a real gate, not just a latch, because I've always believed that a gate means something different than a fence. A fence says, "This is mine." A gate says, "I decide who enters." I'd built it myself 8 years ago when I first took on the land. The wood had weathered gray. When we reached it, Tohono stopped. I had the latch in my hand. I looked back at him. He was looking at the gate with an expression I didn't have a word for then. I have one now. It was the expression of a person standing at the exact threshold between the life they've been living and something they're not sure they're allowed to step into. Not fear. Older than fear. Something closer to grief. The kind that comes from knowing you've needed something for too long and still aren't certain the needing won't make you smaller. I opened the gate. I stepped through and held it open and said nothing. He stood there for 4 seconds. I counted them the way I count things. Then he walked through. I gave him the spare room. I gave him the clean water and the cloth and the medicine I had, and I sat in the kitchen and wrote in the ledger, and listened to the sounds from the other room with the specific, unelegant attention of a person trying to determine if the situation they've created is sustainable. The sounds were breathing, at first ragged, then slowing, cloth moving, water being poured and used, then silence, and then after a while the specific silence that is different from all other silences because it means someone has finally let themselves stop. I sat at the kitchen table and tapped the ledger with 2 fingers. The birds outside had started up again. Somewhere down the south fence line, a coyote made its one-note inquiry into the dark. The Cimarron was too far to hear from here, but I thought about it, about the bend, about the cottonwood, about the shadow that had moved when I was almost ready to turn around and go home. I'd almost turned around. I wrote that in the right margin of the September 9th entry, not as a weather note, just as a fact. Almost turned around. Outside, the September dark settled over the Cimarron land the way it always does, heavy and full, and not particularly interested in what the people inside the houses were deciding. The coyote asked its question once more and got no answer. I turned the page. Fever is a negotiator. That's the thing they don't tell you. You think of it as purely destructive, the body burning something it needs in order to kill something worse. And that's true enough, medically speaking. But the thing fever negotiates away from a person first is the armor, the careful silence, the deliberate distance between what's in the chest and what comes out of the mouth. By the second night, Tohono's fever had found its way into that space. I was in the chair by the spare room door, not inside, out of respect for a boundary I hadn't been invited across, but close enough to hear when he started talking. Not to me, not to anyone in that room. In Apache first, long passages that rose and fell with the cadence of something told many times before, something worn smooth in the telling the way a stone gets smooth in a creek. Then occasionally, a phrase in English, the way a man talking in his sleep sometimes surfaces briefly before going under again. I didn't write any of it down. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came out of him in that room in those hours was his, not mine to archive. But I heard it, and some of what I heard rearranged things in me that had been settled for a long time. He said, at some point in the deepest part of the second night, she told me water remembers where it came from. He said, the horse knew before I did. He said, in a voice so quiet I had to lean toward the door to hear it, I am the last one who knows that song. And then he said something in Apache that I couldn't follow, but the shape of it, the particular shape of grief in the human voice, which has no language because it doesn't need one, was something I understood without translation. I sat in the chair in the hallway and put my hand on the ledger in my coat pocket and did not tap it, just held it, the way you hold something when you need to feel that at least one thing in the world has edges you know. By the third morning, the fever had broken. I know that sounds like a clean sentence. It wasn't a clean event. The breaking of a fever after that length and severity is a slow, wet, exhausted process that left him limp and pale, and more honest-looking than anyone I'd seen in some time. Not because illness makes people honest exactly, but because it strips the performance of self-sufficiency that most of us spend enormous energy maintaining. He was awake when I brought the water in. Fully awake, eyes clear, taking in the room with the deliberate attention of a person relearning their circumstances. He said, "You stayed." I said, "It's my house." He said, "In the hallway for 2 nights." I hadn't realized he'd been aware of that. I opened my mouth to explain that I hadn't been monitoring him, just positioned nearby in case, and then I stopped, because the explanation was going to make me sound like something I was embarrassed to be, which was a person who had been worried. I said, "I told you I had opinions I'd keep to myself. That applies to the sleeping arrangements too." He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "You keep a book." "Ledger? What do you write in it?" "Things that cost money, things that cost time, things I'm not sure which column they belong in yet." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My grandmother kept a similar record, not written. She kept it here." He touched his chest below the collarbone. "She said the land writes on you if you let it." I didn't have an answer for that. I wrote it in the left margin of the September 11th entry, in pencil, with the vague intention of possibly erasing it later. I have not erased it. He was on his feet by the 4th day, moving carefully, with the particular economy of someone managing a body that has recently demonstrated its limits, but moving. I found him in the kitchen that morning, standing at the window that looks south toward the fence line and the creek bend beyond it. He didn't hear me come in, or perhaps he heard me and chose not to mark it. I stood in the doorway and watched him watching the land and thought about what he had said in the fever, the last one who knows that song, and tried to fit that around whatever I could see of him now, standing upright in morning light, and couldn't make it fit, because people are inconveniently more than their worst moments. He said without turning, "You have good land." "It costs," I said. "Everything does." A pause. "Who is south of you?" "Mercer. He runs cattle. We don't speak." "Why?" "Water rights dispute 6 years ago. He fenced my access to the upper creek. I documented it, filed, and eventually won. He's never forgiven me for being right." He turned then. He had the particular expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. "You fight with documents," he said. "I fight with evidence. Documents are just where I keep the evidence." He almost smiled again. This time I was reasonably sure I hadn't invented it. I should tell you what I knew by then, and what I didn't. What I knew: Tohono had been traveling alone for at least 4 days before I found him, moving east from the territorial ranges, pushing through land that had been increasingly hostile to that movement for reasons that required no elaboration for either of us. The wound was from a rifle. He had been traveling with others, and then, at some point that he did not specify and I did not press, he had not been. What I didn't know, where he was going, or whether going was still the right word for it. People travel toward things and they travel away from things, and sometimes, after long enough, those two directions become indistinguishable because the thing behind you and the thing ahead of you have changed enough that neither landmark quite fits the map you started with. He was traveling, I thought. I wasn't sure he was going anywhere. And then he told me about the boy. He told me the way people tell you things when they've been carrying them long enough that the weight has become a kind of companion, not gladly, not as relief, but as a matter of physical necessity. The way you put down something heavy not because you found a good place to set it, but because your arms have simply run out. His sister's son, 8 years old. Name he gave me only once, quietly, in a tone that indicated I was not meant to write it down, and I respected that. The boy had been separated from the group at the crossing, the one Tohono had mentioned on the first night. Not lost. The word Tohono used was taken, with a precision that told me the difference was not an accident of language. He was trying to find the boy. He had been trying for 4 days, wounded, on foot, on land where most of the people he encountered would read his presence as a threat rather than a search. He said, "I know approximately where they took him." He said, "I cannot approach it directly. I have tried." He said, "I need someone who can walk in the front way." He did not say, "I need you." He didn't arrange his face into appeal or soften his voice into request. He stated the situation with the flat precision of a man who has learned, through enough repetition to qualify as education, that what he needs and what he is permitted to ask for occupy different territories, and who has decided to describe the gap without crossing into it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened the ledger. Not to write anything. I think I just needed to feel the edges of it, the known weight of it. I said, "Tell me the location." He looked at me. I said, "I'm going to need the specific location and everything you observed about the pattern of movement. I have paper." He said, "Why?" 1 syllable. The same question as the creek bank, same compression, same weight of everything it wasn't saying. I said, "You already asked me that." You didn't fully answer. I put the ledger on the table between us. Open. Blank page on the right, September 11th on the left with its margin notes. "Because your sister's son is 8 years old," I said, "and I have a front door and a wagon and a name that means something in 2 of the 3 places you're describing. And because the creek was quiet last night for the first time in 4 days, and I think that means something's shifting, and I'd rather be on the moving side of it than the standing still." He looked at the ledger, at the margin note I hadn't erased. He said, "She told me water remembers where it came from." I said, "I know, I heard you." He was quiet for a long time. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor the way it does in September, slowly, with the particular quality of light that knows the days are getting shorter and isn't quite reconciled to it. Then he said, "The location is 30 miles northeast. There is a relay station." I turned to a clean page. What I will not do is give you the full plan as though it were a column in a ledger, clean and complete. Plans don't work that way, and I'd be lying to you if I framed it as though I had certainty about any part of what came next. What I had was information, a wagon, and the kind of stubbornness that sometimes disguises itself as courage because courage sounds better in the telling. What Tohono had was knowledge I didn't, of the land, of the patterns, of the specific way that a system treats people it has decided are not quite real, which makes those people expert navigators of the system's blind spots. He knew which part of the station's routine would create a window. He knew which man at that station had a reputation for looking away when it served him to look away, and how to make it serve him. What neither of us had was time to be particularly careful about the risks. I wrote the plan in the ledger in pencil, all of it, everything. Then I went to bed, because the third thing we needed was sleep, and I wasn't going to find it sitting at the kitchen table pretending I wasn't frightened. I lay in the dark and listened to the house. In the spare room, silence. Not the silence of someone lying awake. The silence of someone who has, perhaps for the first time in a long time, allowed themselves to be in a place long enough to fall asleep in it. I tapped the bedpost twice with 2 fingers. Outside, the Cimarron ran its September course, low and deliberate, remembering, the way water apparently does, where it had come from. We left before light. Not because the plan required it, exactly. More because neither of us had spoken about when we were leaving, and we both woke at the same time, in the particular pre-dawn dark that is neither night nor morning. And by the time I was in the kitchen he was already there, and by the time the coffee had been made neither of us had mentioned going back to sleep. So we left before light, which is maybe the most honest time to leave for something you're not entirely sure about. The wagon was my working wagon, nothing conspicuous, which was a relative assessment given that the most conspicuous element of the trip was the man sitting beside me. We discussed this. There wasn't a solution that wasn't a risk, and we'd chosen the risk we could manage over the risk we couldn't. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the road ahead. The wound was better, not healed, not close to healed, but managed, which is a different category and sometimes the only category available. He had a particular way of sitting that I noticed now, the same way you notice a habit only after you've been around someone long enough for it to become familiar. His right hand rested flat on his right knee, pressing lightly, and I realized after a while that he was monitoring the wound this way, not dramatically, not consciously perhaps, just keeping a hand on the thing that might need attention so he'd know before it told him loudly. I did the same thing with the ledger. It occurred to me, watching him not watch the road, that most of the significant knowledge I carry in my body before I carry it in a book. 30 miles in September with a horse that was good but not young takes the better part of a morning. We didn't talk much for the first hour, which suited both of us. The land changed as we moved northeast, less grass, more scrub, the long flat distances that make you feel either enormous or very small depending on what you're carrying. He said at some point in the second hour, "Tell me about Mercer." I looked at him. "The man south of you," he said, "the water rights." "Why?" "Because you said you fought him with evidence. I want to understand what that means, to fight that way." It was not a simple request. I understood that. He was asking me to explain something about a world that had been systematically designed to exclude him from the mechanisms it offered to people like me, and he was asking it in the specific tone of someone who needed to understand the system, not because they believed in it, but because they had to navigate it. I told him about Mercer. I told him about the fence, and the survey maps, and the county filing, and the 3 separate hearings where I had sat across from Mercer and his lawyer, and presented documentation with the patience of a man who had been keeping records his whole life and had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that it was going to matter eventually. Tohono listened without interrupting. Then he said, "The records you kept before you needed them, that's what won." "Yes. My people kept records too, in different forms. They were not recognized." I had nothing adequate to say to that. I said nothing, which felt inadequate in a different way, but at least it wasn't false. He nodded once, as though I'd said something. The relay station came into view at mid-morning. It was not what I'd pictured from his description, smaller, more ordinary, the kind of place that does what it does without needing to look like what it is. A main building, 2 outbuildings, a corral, 3 horses in the corral, 2 men visible from the road, moving between the main building and the nearer outbuilding with the unhurried efficiency of a routine they'd done many times. I felt the specific tightening in the chest that I associate with the moment before you do something you can't take back. Tohono said quietly, "The man on the left." I said, "I see him. His name is Ames. He worked a territorial census 3 years ago. He has a flexibility in his record-keeping when approached correctly." I looked at the man on the left, Ames. Average height, average build. The kind of face that registers as forgettable until you know what to look for, and then registers as something else. I said, "What does approached correctly mean for a man like that?" "It means approaching him as though you are offering him a way to remember this morning differently than it happened. He will understand." I thought about that. What is it I'm telling him? That the boy is your ward, that there has been a miscommunication in the processing, that you have come to correct it with documentation. I don't have documentation for a ward I've never met. You have a ledger in your pocket with your name on the cover, and more handwriting in it than any document they will ask to actually read. I looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead, his right hand flat on his right knee. "You've thought about this more than you've said," I said. "I've had 4 days to think about it." He said that without inflection. 4 days of walking, wounded, through hostile land, trying to figure out what combination of the world's own tools could be turned to extract one 8-year-old boy from the place the world had put him. 4 days. I picked up the reins. "Stay back from the road," I said. "I'll signal when." He said, "If it goes wrong. Then I'll need the ledger back because I've written things in it I'd rather not lose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand in his coat and handed me something small. The leather band with the beadwork from his wrist. The one I'd noticed at the creek bank, first night, the pattern from the southeastern ranges. He said, "If you show him that, Ames will know I'm not far. He'll want this finished faster." I looked at the band. He said, "It belonged to my grandmother." I understood then what he was handing me. Not a prop. A cost. He was handing me something that cost him as leverage, because it was the most valuable thing he had that could serve the purpose, and he had done the calculation between the cost and the need and arrived at this. I took it carefully. I drove the wagon to the station. What happened at the station, I will tell you efficiently because it was not a dramatic event in the way stories are supposed to be dramatic. It was an event in the way that real things are unglamorous, specific, dependent on small details. Ames was exactly what Tohono had described. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the beadwork band. He looked at me with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating a morning he'd thought he had figured out. He asked me 2 questions. I answered them in the flat, documented tone of a person who has been answering official questions for 30 years and finds them only mildly inconvenient. He went to the nearer outbuilding. I waited by the wagon with my hand on the ledger, and my heart doing things I was deliberately not monitoring. Ames came back with the boy. "I want to be careful here. Not careful about the facts. The facts are simple enough." The boy came out of that building, squinting in the mid-morning light, thin, watchful, braced in the particular way of a child who has learned that being braced is a survival posture. He was wearing clothes that weren't his. He was holding himself together with a dignity that 8 years old should not have to know how to do. I want to be careful because what happened in the next 30 seconds doesn't belong to me. It was private in a way that 4 days of traveling wounded and alone, and trying to figure out what combination of the world's tools could open a closed door. It was private in a way that 4 days earns. I walked the boy to the wagon. We drove back down the road. When we reached the place where Tohono was waiting, I stopped the horse. I did not watch what happened next. I looked at the road ahead and I found a small, private emotion that I don't have a clean ledger column for. Not joy exactly. Not relief. Something quieter than both. Something that felt like the very last moment before a held breath releases. The boy said a word in Apache, just one word. I heard Tohono make a sound that I had not heard him make in 4 days, and would not have predicted from anything I knew of him. The sound a person makes when they have held something too tightly for too long and finally, the thing they were holding is back in the world. I tapped the ledger twice with 2 fingers. We drove back west as the afternoon started its slow lean toward evening. The boy sat between us on the bench, not speaking much, watching the land with the alert, measuring attention of a child who has recently learned that the world contains more categories than he was raised to expect. After a while he said to me, "You have a book." I said, "Ledger." He said, "What's in it?" I said, "Costs, weather, things I'm not sure which column they belong in." He thought about this with the seriousness that children bring to information they intend to actually use. Then he said, "My uncle says water remembers where it came from." I looked at Tohono over the boy's head. He was looking at the road. The right hand was still on the right knee, pressing lightly. But something in his face had changed, something around the eyes, something I don't have precise vocabulary for, which is its own kind of answer. "Your uncle's grandmother told him that," I said. The boy looked at me with the expression of someone encountering information from an unexpected direction. "You knew her," he said. "No," I said, "but he told me." The boy considered this. Then he leaned very slightly against his uncle's arm, not dramatically, not seeking comfort in any obvious way, just contact, just the small, total reassurance of a shoulder that is there. I won't tell you I resolved anything by the end of that day. I won't tell you the land was different when we drove back south along the fence line, or that the Cimarron looked any other way than it always looks in September, or that the wooden gate seemed symbolic when I unlatched it. What I will tell you is that they stayed 3 more days, that the boy helped me with the morning water routine with an enthusiasm that I found mostly inconvenient and occasionally excellent, that Tohono and I talked in the evenings with the particular quality of conversation that happens between people who have been through something together that they're not ready to name yet but can't quite stop circling. On the morning of the 4th day, I found them ready to leave. Not dramatically, just packed, standing in the early light, the boy carrying something wrapped in cloth that I didn't ask about. Tohono handed me the grandmother's leather band. I said, "I'm returning that to you." "I know," he said, "you returned it at the station." I took the band. I put it in the ledger pocket, the small inside pocket, where I keep the things that don't have a column yet. He said, "The gate." "Open," I said. He said, "Keep it that way." I didn't have an answer for that either, and maybe that was right. Some statements don't need answers. They need the space where an answer would be, held open, like a gate that stopped being a decision and started being a posture. They walked south, the two of them, into the September morning, the boy asking Tohono something in Apache with the relentless enthusiasm of 8-year-olds who have recently escaped something terrible and are now interested in everything. I stood at the gate and watched them until they were the size of margin notes. Then I went inside and opened the ledger. Left column, the costs. Right column, the weather, which had been clear and dry the whole week, which seemed either appropriate or ironic depending on how you felt about the weather caring about anything. The margin in pencil. The creek was not empty. I thought about erasing it.